Rabbi Abraham Isaac Ha-Cohen Cook on the actual day of his yahrzeit, which is the 3rd of Elul, which is today, Sunday, August, 16th or 16th. So it's a special schus. When you learn the Torah of a tzaddik, there's always this idea of they're learning along with you. But especially on the yahrzeit, it's a special time to be learning Rav Kook's Torah. So let's talk a little bit about his background, and then we're going to talk about his teachings. And the main thing I wanted to kind of focus on is his relationship with the Hasidic teachers that I have a particular interest on. That's kind of why I'm giving the talk. So let me explain. Everybody has heard about Rabbi Kook, and they heard that he was the chief rabbi of Palestine right up until 1935, if they knew that information. And they also know that in Israel today, a lot of his followers are involved in for example, the Hester yeshivas, the yeshivas where they combine learning Torah with military service. They may also know politically that the followers of his son created what we call Gush Emunim, the block of the settlements, the people who basically settled the West Bank and the various places. So politically, that's a hot potato on the Upper West Side. If I would go into Zabar's, they wouldn't like that. He wasn't responsible because he didn't even live to see the founding of the State of Israel, but his followers were involved in that. And in other words, what Joel is asking is like, can you actually say what's happening today in Israel is it directly coming out of what he said, or is it indirect? And I would argue that it's indirect, but it's because of circumstances. That's a class in and of itself. I don't know. It's hard to prophesy. It's hard to know what he would have supported when certainly that's the way his son would see it. So obviously who was his main disciple. So obviously a lot of people see it like that. Okay. But there's another phenomena, and I'm not really here to speak about the current influence of Rav Kook and how much of it is a direct line or indirect line, because that's a very complicated thing that I'm not prepared to speak about. But I do want to make one little foray into that. There's something now called Habakkuk. Habakkuk is Chabad, Breslov, Kalba, Cook. Breslov. What? Chabad Cook was a prophet, but that's not what I'm referring to. You're right. It's correct. You are correct. What it means today is a certain segment of the religious society, religious Zionists of Israel, who are students of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Ha-Cohen Cook. They're also students of Chassidism, particularly Chabad and Breslov. They're also somewhat influenced by Kabbah, at least musically. And what I would like to argue and say,
Naftali, this is the scariest combination I've ever heard of.
Yeah, I know. But
this is frightening.
Comments we're going to save for later. First, listen, hear me out. The thing that's missing in that acronym, that in my humble opinion is maybe the most important, is the influence of Reb Tzadok Ha-Cohen of Lublin, who was I consider him the primary student of the Mei HaShiloach of Ishbitz. Of course, the Mei HaShiloach also had his son, Rabbi Yaakov Leiner. He had other children and grandchildren and other disciples like Rabbi Leibel Eger, and they're all very significant thinkers in their own right. But for some reason, Reb Tzadok in this equation plays a critical role in understanding the work of Rav Kook, and I believe also in understanding what is unfolding in Israel. And I'm not talking about what's unfolding in Israel. Now let's go back to Rav Kook. That's by way of introduction. So who is Rav Kook? And to help me prepare for today's talk, I used the following 4 books. I used this book called Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution by Yehuda Mirsky. And before I go on, I have to say that for many years, I tried to read Rav Kook, and I could not understand him. And it got to the point where it was frustrating, especially in Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Orot HaTshuva, which I really liked, and I would study. I couldn't find like a way of really getting his philosophy. I was just struggling with trying to figure out what his philosophy was. And a bunch of years ago, we had a book club, and I perused the book then. How many years ago did they do this? It was a little long. It was a little what? It was during the early COVID. Not early, yeah. I came to that meeting. It was after COVID, yeah. Well, and also we actually brought him here for a day of Kabbalah as well. So one of the things I picked up from the book is that I was kind of reading Rav Kook incorrectly. I thought he was a philosopher, which the book doesn't say he's not a philosopher, but it's clear that he had such a poetic spirit and such a kind of, don't sit here if you're going to eat, because I don't want to pick up can somebody else sit here. Somebody switch with the. So that if you read him as a philosopher, what you try to do when you're reading somebody's work and you were told they're a philosopher, is you're trying to get a certain methodology of how they understand the world, and I just wasn't able to pick it up. And I think that's because I was reading it with philosophy, him as a philosopher in mind, and I think that's the wrong way to read him. The way to read him is a tortured soul who was a poet, who was interested in philosophy, who might have used philosophical words, who came back to certain philosophical themes, and may or may not have been a philosopher. But that's him being a philosopher cannot be the way you read him, initially at least, because you're just not going to understand him. He's very verbose, he's very poetic, and he's very emotional. But we'll get to that. I'll explain why. Okay. So that's the credit that I really recommend this book for beginners and even people who are tried to read Rav Kook and are struggling. This book, you can pass it around, will be very helpful, and just make sure you get it back. Another book, and there's a lot of books being written about Rav Kook, and we could talk about why right now in the last 15 years or so, there has been an explosion of Rav Kook studies and so many people writing about Rav Kook. And by the way, the books that I'm not quoting, it's not because they're second rate, they might be first rate. I just, didn't have time to read them. The second book is by Mark Shapiro. It's called Renewing the Old and Sanctifying the New, one of Rav Kook's most famous quotes. And Mark Shapiro is a scholar who has various interests, but why did he write a book about Rav Kook? Rav Kook wasn't something that he was primarily involved in up until relatively recently. And that's because the teachings of Rav Kook resonate with a broader program that Mark Shapiro is interested in, which is how the religious world views the secular world, how the religious world views the rabbinic authority versus the kind of common sense of the masses of Jewish religious people who are not per se steeped in the Talmud. Also about how people edit rabbinic texts, how editors take liberties with editing out things that would seem to be embarrassing or too provocative. And a lot of these themes coalesce in the more recent released notebooks of Rav Kook. And that's one of the reasons why Mark Shapiro, who's a good writer and a thoughtful person, wrote this book. I honestly, I'm not, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, yes. Yeah. Two other books that I'll point out that I looked at to prepare for today's shir is the Orot HaTshuva. Is a pretty good translation. It's very hard to translate him, so there's no such thing as a good translation of Rav Kook because he's so hard to translate, but it's pretty good. By Yaakov David Shulman, and that's Orot HaTshuva is arguably his most popular work, and it's great to study in Elul in anticipation of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And then finally, Orot HaTorah, great book. It's almost like a sister book to Orot HaTshuva because it talks about the spiritual elements of studying Torah. Okay, now that's a little bit about things we're going to be quoting today. Let's talk a little bit about Rav Kook's background. And I think to be able to understand his contributions, we also have to understand exactly when and where he was growing up as an adolescent, as a teenager, as a young scholar. He was born, I believe I said 1865. Somebody could Google that and look it up to verify that. And he grew up in the culture of Talmudic emphasis in which his father's family was steeped in. For lack of a better word, they were misnagdim. His father and his family were misnagdim. They were connected to the Volozhin yeshiva. I think at some point his father was one of the fundraisers for the Volozhin yeshiva. Now, to learn more about the Volozhin yeshiva at that time, I'll refer you back to a two-part series I just released and taught here in person on Reb Chaim of Brisk. Now, even though Reb Chaim of Brisk was the junior Rosh Yeshiva at the time that Rabbi Kook would enter into the yeshiva as, I believe, a 17-year-old, and he would spend approximately a year and a half there. A lot of how he was shaped had to do with the students that he met and the teachers that he had while in the Volozhin yeshiva. He actually received smicha in the Volozhin yeshiva, which is, if he must have been all of 19, a very young man to receive smicha, but he was already known as an Eloi from the town that he came from, as a prodigy, as a Talmudic genius. The thing I left out that's very significant is that his mother's family were not misnagdim. They were Chassidim. And his grandfather on his mother's side had been a disciple of the Tzemach Tzedek of Chabad, the third Chabad Rebbe. And their family continued the Tzemach Tzedek. I know a little bit about this because the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Rebbe of Chabad, had a number of sons. There's one son who didn't enter into the family business. What's the family business? Being a Rebbe. So I know that because you know who descended from the son who wasn't a Rebbe? the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and me as well. So we have a common ancestor. We're cousins through the son that went into business. But all of the other sons became Rebbes. Now, you can't all become Rebbes and have the same title. So the Rebbe that was the family, the mother's family of Rav Kook followed, was the Kappister Rebbe. The Kappist was a branch of Chabad. Okay? A lot of people you ever heard of Kappist? Okay, well now you have. Okay? So it was a branch of Chabad. And you could read their Chassidus. I've read some of their Chassidus. It's the same as Chabad. Obviously, if you're a scholar, you'll try to say, well, there's a difference. Okay, there's probably some difference. Like every two rabbis who are part of the same tradition have nuanced differences, but they're the same. Now, so let me explain to you something. When you have Hasidim and Misnagdim in the same house, it's not so simple, because you have to understand, just 100 years earlier, so if this is 1865, when he's growing up, it's 1870, 1875, just 100 years earlier, there were violent altercations between Hasidim and Misnagdim. I don't want to get into the details of how badly some of the time that ended. I'd like to say that mostly the Misnagdim attacked the Hasidim, because I come from Hasidic stock and would like to believe that. So if in 1765 there was unadulterated violence between Hasidim and Misnagdim, you could imagine that 100 years later, there was still a lot of leftover animosity. It wasn't a burning hot fight with physical violence, but there was a tension that definitely existed between Hasidim and Misnagdim. So the first foundation of who little Rav Kook was who am I? Am I a Chassid like my mother? Or am I a Misnagid like my father? And if you understand that inner conflict, that'll help you understand the bedrock of the inner turmoil. I mentioned a word that somebody asked me, what does that mean to say that he was tormented? I use the word tormented. So the torment started at home in terms of an identity. Am I a chassid or am I a misnagid? And now let me be more specific. On the one hand, he's an Eloi. So when you're an Eloi today, I don't know if they had the same pressure but I believe they did, even if the terminology was different. Today, if there's an Eloi, if there's an outstanding child in Talmud study, in the litvish world that he was a part of, then as today, there was a tremendous pressure to what we term become a Gadol. I know you're laughing. It's not funny. It's a real thing. If there's a child that's a genius and able to master Talmud and comprehend it, his teachers start meeting with the parents and say, you don't understand, or maybe you do, but your child is special and there are great things in store for them, and we want to help make sure they go to study in the right yeshivas, even if they have to travel to go with the best Rosh yeshivas, so they can become a Gadol Hadar, they could become one of the giants, one of the leaders, one of the Torah masters of the generation. I'm going to assume, it's hearsay, but there's no reason why not to assume so, that from his father's side, and from what they would say about him, that he's an Eloi, that he was a genius, that there's this tremendous pressure on him to become a Gadol Hadar, to become one of the greats of the generation. Now, why am I assuming that? Why? It's not so much hearsay. It's actually based on many, many tormented words in which he says in many of his private writings, and this is the reason why there's an explosion in the last 15 years or so of interest and writing about Rav Kook, is because only about 25 years ago, and to some more extent about 16 years ago, did his unpublished writings that included his notebooks and his journals, his personal journals, become published. And so that's why there's a renewed interest, because up until now, his writings have basically been his son or one of his other students going through his manuscripts and culling and presenting a book based on his teachings. But as important as it is what they did say in his name is what they left out. That's why, Mark, can I have my books back so I can still do show and tell for the audience? Thank you. That's why I need them. I'll take them. You can look at these ones right now. But that's why this book, right, by Mark Shapiro, was written after those things became released, because he has that interest in when you publish, what you edit, what are you leaving out? They left out a lot of interesting things. Now, one of the things, I don't know if they left it out so much, but I think they did, for the most part, leave it out, is that he was conflicted and tortured with his responsibility that he felt to be steeped in Gemara and Halacha, that he often didn't feel that passion for. He felt he was lacking in motivation and interest in, for lack of a better word, conquering the sea of the Talmud and becoming a halachic giant. Now, he was a halachic giant. He is known for his halachic responsa, which, of course, many of those things put him into direct conflict with the rabbinate of the old yeshuv. You might have heard of Chaim Sonnenfeld, who was the rabbi of the old yeshuv, and they were frenemies. They got along on a personal level, but on a level of what they stood for, they were almost diametrically opposed. They had gone on some missions together. They did a 30-day trip. They traveled together to go to various kibbutzim and outposts, settler outposts, so to speak, because then they were settling the land. The way they settled the land, this is before the state of Israel. Most people don't know. They bought large tracts of land, farms. So by the time the state of Israel became a state, the ownership of the majority of that state were owned by Jews who had bought this land, which must be why now there's, in the Palestinian Authority, they literally will kill someone who sells something to, I don't know if it's officially from the Palestinian Authority, but if they find out that a Palestinian sold a home in East Jerusalem to a Jew, that guy is going to be dead. They're going to kill them. Then they didn't know that, so we bought land. And we ended up with all of this land. Now, who farmed the land? Socialists. Today, they would have voted for Mandami. They were much worse than that back then, many of them. Like, if you think it's a new thing, why are the young Jewish people voting for Mandami? It's stupid. How stupid can stupid get? They were even stupider back then. And all the rabbis knew it, except for Rav Kook. My great-grandfather, Zalman Schneerson, went to Israel in the early mid-30s. And maybe it was around the time of Rav Kook's passing. I don't know if it was 35 or 36, or whatever year it was. He went to Israel it wasn't the state of Israel. or socialists or communists. There were Stalinist communists who believed in Stalin. And he said, you don't understand. This person killed my family. He's probably killed your family. You don't even know. You're not hearing from them. What do you think it is? Because everything is so rosy over there? Yeah, at that time to veto a few years later in 1948 the recognition of the state of Israel. But who was the premier in Russia at that time, Peter? 48. Stalin. Okay, yeah, Stalin. So Stalin said, "Oh, I have a lot of fans in Israel. Those idiots, believe in me." So he okayed the state of Israel based on these idiots. Now I'm calling them idiots. Rav Kook had infinite patience for them. Rav Kook loved these people. I call them idiots because I know in retrospect they made a big mistake, but they didn't know it at the time. They were idealists. They really felt that communism is going to take away anti-Semitism and it's going to empower the workers. They believed all the propaganda, just like the idiots now believe they're going to get all this free stuff. They don't realize that it's anti-American. This whole project is anti-American, anti-capitalist. And so they're not thinking straight. They didn't think straight either. But that's enough with my rant. Rav Kook was an idealist, and he wanted to believe them. So let's get back on track. So he has a Hasidic mother that's against this desire to become a Gadol and to focus solely on Talmud. So, for example, if we take when he was in Volozhin, he was under the influence of the Nitziv. Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was the head of the yeshiva at that time. The yeshiva closed eventually because the government wanted to impose secular studies, and you might say, who cares? Yeshiva University is a great example. Then it was an entirely different time. The secular influences of what we would call within the Jewish realm, the Haskalah, by and large, even though there were religious members of the Haskalah, by and large, they were anti-religious. So his friends were other students who were very devout, very against the Haskalah, but also some of his study partners were influenced by the Haskalah. So much so that the story is told that many of the Haskalah members in the yeshiva would secretly have Russian literature. Haskalah is the Jewish Enlightenment. They would have a book of Haskalah literature or other literature, literary works that were not allowed in the yeshiva, hidden underneath the Gemara. And when no one was looking, they'd pull it out. They'd read it for 20 minutes, then put it back and repeat. Somebody, one of the rabbis there, saw Rabbi Kook doing something that looked suspicious. Every once in a while, he would pull out some paper and he would look at it and then he would put it away. So the rabbi, thinking that he had some illicit literature of the Haskalah, came and took the paper. And you know what it was? It were the names of God. Rav Kook was looking at the names of God to have the right kavanot. Now that's, by the way, a Kabbalistic thing. So even in Volozhin, he had exposure to Haskalah, he had exposure to the Nitziv, and he also had exposure there were co-Rosh Yeshivas at that time. The junior Rosh Yeshiva was Reb Chaim of Brisk. Reb Chaim of Brisk was developing the most comprehensive analytic system, what we now call the Brisker Derech, named after him, named after the town, him, that developed this analytical style that if you're interested in knowing what it is, I have it. Go and learn it. It's online, right? Go to my YouTube channel, go and learn it. You can in 2 hours get a little bit of taste of what it is. He didn't take to Reb Chaim. He took to the Nitziv. And Reb Chaim was a genius, and he could get exactly who somebody was very quickly. I actually told the story of the rabbi of Dvinsk, Reb Reuven, who I told the story about. Reb Chaim needed to get a faher, needed to pass a test to get his title as like a junior Rosh Yeshiva from this Reb Reuven of Dvinsk. And that same Reb Reuven was also a powerful teacher in Rav Kook's life as a young man. So there's all these crossovers. So here's what Rav Chaim said about Rav Kook. Rav Kook is an 18-year-old, and he's a genius, but he's a tortured soul. He's looking at the names of God. That's not the way they do things in Volozhin. He said, beware of the tzaddik, Avraham Kook. Beware means be careful about this guy. This guy's not going to be he's not going to be the way I would like him to be, right? And he's going to be something, but not the way I'm trying to mold my students to be. And tzaddik, in the way Mark Shapiro says it, was not a compliment in Volozhin. The compliment would be a lamdan, a deep thinker, a learner, but a tzaddik, a righteous person, is not a compliment from Reb Chaim of Brisk. So they were both right. For each their respective, but when you have these different viewpoints, they each, from their perspective, they're right? Reb Chaim is warning this guy, A, he's not taking to me, and B, even if he's taking to my wife's grandfather, he's not that either. He's something else. He's starting something of his own. Because the whole thing about Reb Chaim of Brisk is not only he was a genius in his own methodology, he was a genius in other people's methodologies. So he saw already the budding potential of a new thing going on in this 18-year-old, and it wasn't his thing. Yes, Reb Chaim was a Rosh Yeshiva there. Now I mentioned before that, so he's now balancing being a chassid and a misnagid. And the reason why he's going to continue to struggle with this is because on the one hand, he's going to have these mystical experiences, and they pervade his notebooks. And it's going to bother him that learning the details of halacha and having to answer anybody's question about anything, which is the European Rav's job, was to answer halachic questions. In fact, Reb Chaim of Brisk, when he went to accept the job of being the Rav in Brisk, only took it on one condition, that he be accompanied by another rabbi who would by and large be the one to answer people's halachic questions. Because he knew that if he would answer halachic questions from morning to night, people would be coming in with, now we have OU and OK and Star K and Chaf K, we have 100 kosher labels. Then the kosher label was the rabbi. You came in and you say, this is how the chicken looks. There's something off with the chicken. Is it kosher or not? I used milk pan with a meat dish. Is it kosher or not? These are the questions that would come before the rabbi constantly. So Reb Chaim of Brisk said, I'm going to have a co-rabbi. That way I can be a teacher. I can sit on a basin, but I'm not going to be the one that everyone comes with every question. When that rabbi is out of town, they'll come to me, but otherwise they'll go to him. So this is the same, but that was because time was precious to Reb Chaim. But when it came to Rav Kook, it wasn't just that he felt like it was not always a good use of his time to be available to answer questions or to have to continuously study Gemara and Halacha to know the answer to these questions. He felt it wasn't what his soul wanted. Now, this is going to lead me to say, that so what? So your soul doesn't want it. So do less of it. Accommodate yourself. Easier said than done. In fact, he makes a theoretical accommodation in this book. I believe he wrote this book for himself. What do I mean he wrote the book for himself? First of all, he didn't write the book. He never wrote a book called Orot HaTorah. He didn't write the book. What he did is he wrote feelings about Torah learning in his journals, and his son went through the journals, looked up things that were Torah, did a masterful work of putting this together. But let me tell you what's missing. The true inner conflict that he experienced is not in the book. Instead is the resolution of the conflict, which is, even though sometimes I feel like the halachot are too burdensome to be able to spend that many hours studying, and the Gemara is too complex to really put my time and energy into, because I want to be in the mystical world of Kabbalah and the spiritual planes. It's a necessity because I have to have my feet on the ground. I have to integrate the higher and the lower. So in the book Orot HaTorah, he talks about the spiritual elements of the Torah as, let's say, being a root, and the more tangible elements of Jewish practice as being a branch. And the roots and the branches have to be connected. In other words, he gives all these metaphors of the relationship between the mystical and the practical. And he resolves the tension that never really was resolved in him. It's like, it's like somebody saying, I wish I could resolve this tension between having big ideas but being stuck working in an office. Oh, I think I have an idea of how I can do that. I'll work in the office on the big ideas. And remember, when I have to do the tedious work that my boss asks me to do, or whatever need is, then it's part of the only way I can get to the big ideas. And does that really happen? Probably not. Probably going to stay frustrated. So there's this theoretical book where Rav Kook puts forward the answer to his own conundrum, but then there's his own life that it's continuously a conundrum. Now I want to get into the thing I said I'm going to talk about, which is I put out in this little piece of paper. Yeah, I'll give you the piece of paper about Reb Tzadok. Now, who is Reb Tzadok, and why do I think it's important that I want to talk about Reb Tzadok in the context of Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Ha-Cohen Kook? I already mentioned there's a connection between Chabad, a family connection between the mother of Rav Kook and the Chabad Kappas dynasty. I also mentioned that he was a student of Kabbalah. Various people, I believe B'Tzalel Naor has written about contemporaries of Rav Kook in terms of people he studied Kabbalah with. They said he studied Kabbalah with the Leshem, the grandfather of Rabbi Yashiv. But what about Reb Tzadok? So Reb Tzadok has a very similar background to Rav Kook. Reb Tzadok was known as an Eloi. He was known as a tremendous Talmudic genius. We'll talk about him next Sunday, so I'm not going to spend time explaining of what level of genius he was. Everything will be next Sunday. He lived before Rav Kook was active, meaning their lives overlapped. Reb Tzadok was actually Reb Tzadok was active in the early lifetime of the young Rabbi Kook. And I'm assuming that at some point, certain works of Reb Tzadok came into the hands of Rav Kook. Not early on, because early on, he might not have had access. I don't know from what period. But the one thing that when I'm rereading or reading the works of Rav Kook in the light of the newer publications, and more of a openness to explore his inner conflict that comes out in his notebook, so to speak, that he talks about this inner conflict. One of the things that seem to appear are ideas that are very similar to Reb Tzadok and his teacher, the Mei Shuvah. Now, you could arguably say it's just a coincidence, but it gets to the point where it can't be all of these coincidences. So, for example, this was pointed out by Shaul Magid, and you could take this or leave it because this is on its own. It's not at all a proof, but one of the teachings of the Mei Shuvah is that as we get closer to Mashiach, we're actually more refined, as opposed to many of the other rabbinic outlook of the times are getting worse because we're getting further away from the revelation of Sinai, so we're one step removed in every generation further away. But in Ishbitz, there's this idea that we're getting closer. So Shaul Magid in one of our workshops on Ishbitz said, he quoted Rav Kook with his inner struggle that he knows he should learn more Gemara and more Halacha, but his soul is telling him, I want to learn Kabbalah. I want to do other spiritual things. So he said that Rav Kook is like mimicking or mirroring, I should say a more positive word, mirroring this idea of the Ishbitzer and Reb Tzadok of times are changing. And because the idea is that as we're getting closer, something that was a given generations earlier are no longer a given, and we can do new things, which is part of the Ishbitzer is saying in potential, we're going to be able to open things up again as we refine ourselves more. Because part of the Ishbitz Reb Tzadok tradition is that throughout history, there are times of contractions and opening up. And part of opening up is that we'll have a more broad ability to transform things that were, let's say, forbidden in the past, like rabbinic enactments. Rabbinic enactments forbid certain things because we're afraid we're going to also violate a biblical law. So one of the main ideas in Ishbitz is that, well, it depends. If just like the rabbis can make a restriction to say, you can't do this because if you do this, you're going to come to do that, they can also open it up. There are certain qualifications they need to have, like the Gemara already talks about that. They have to be equal or greater in numbers and in wisdom to be able to do that. But the fact remains that just because they made a restriction doesn't mean it's going to have to. Now, the details, learn the Gemara. The details, learn the halacha. By the way, a lot of what the Ishbitzer and Tzadok says are very well integrated into the Gemara. A lot of people see them as these revolutionaries, and they were. But the real revolution is that they sourced everything they said, particularly Reb Tzadok. Tzadok was a Talmudic genius who knew all of the Talmud by heart, most of the commentaries by heart, all of the Zohar, all of the Kisvei. He knew all of that, and he was able to integrate his teachers' methods into that structure. The same thing could be arguably said about one of the obsessions that bothered and tortured a young Rav Kook was hearing this ideological enthusiasm that people had to the variety of isms, communism, socialism, nationalism, Zionism. He didn't believe those people were bad people. He believed that they were making a mistake to cut off those isms from Judaism. He believed they needed to be integrated. Now, like I said before, maybe it's hindsight, but I think a lot of those people were making a grave mistake, thinking that communism, even including Stalinism, were a correct way. Okay, but they didn't have information, because part of being, Stalin is also creating a narrative of what he wants the West to know about Soviet Russia under Stalin. So they were lied to. So they're not necessarily idiots. They were ideologically motivated because they didn't like the way things were in Russia. These people grew up in not Soviet Russia. They grew up in Tsarist Russia. There was a lot of oppression, a lot of anti-Semitism, and they weren't the only ones oppressed. Okay, so in that regard, there is no real exact parallel in Reb Tzadok and the Meshilach to being open to all of these nationalisms and things like that. But there's one thing, and he talks about natural law, and it's not clear. Updated to be more, for lack of a better word, progressive. The best meaning of progressive, of human rights. Countries like America, right? That was becoming like, no, that's the way to treat people, not the way they're treated in Russia, where there's a permanent underclass, and then there's other religions that are oppressed and minorities that are oppressed, and so on and so forth. So in that regard, the Meshilach, Reb Tzadok say there are certain qualities that every nation has. And perhaps we're in that nation to derive that quality from them. They've actually almost, I think he might have even used the word like they've perfected that quality. The only problem is they need a balance. And he reinterprets what Judaism is, which is, in part, it's taking the quality of that nation's experience and integrating it into the balance. So it's almost as if Judaism is like the not a sponge that just sops up everything, but a filter that takes in what it can and learns from the nation, so to speak. And there's a similar teaching where I don't know if it's Tzadok as well as the Meshilach says, if you see a certain stringency in the nations, let's say they stop allowing polygamy, we also have to stop allowing polygamy. Meaning Jewish history has allowed polygamy in biblical times, right? The patriarch Abraham had 2 wives. The patriarch Jacob had 4 wives. You're doing the math. Only Isaac had only 1 wife, right? But then by the time of the Talmud, we don't find the rabbis to have more than 1 wife, yet they didn't outlaw it till much later, till about 1,000 years ago. And even that wasn't outlawed for all of the Sephardic communities. So Reb Tzadok and the Meshilach would say, if you see a certain higher level of, so to speak, I don't know, not the word sanctity, but ethics in the nations, we have to some degree, reflect that back. We can't be the more promiscuous, even if it's allowed in the Torah. So even if the Torah allowed slavery, if the world says slavery is forbidden, it is forbidden for us too. If the world says polygamy is forbidden, it's forbidden for us too. That was an idea that did appeal to Rav Kook, that we have to learn from the nations look at morality and ethics. And another thing is he also says, and this captures the interest of Mark Shapiro, because Mark Shapiro is very into this, as is Chaim Soloveitchik, each in their respective way, which is there's something called the Torah of the mothers. What is the Torah of the mothers? The Torah of the mothers is what happened in your house. If you grew up in a religious household, how did they observe the laws of kashrut? What did my father do on the night of the Seder? What did my mother do in the kitchen? Now, if you didn't grow up in that type of a religious household, so then you're lacking of that. And Chaim Soloveitchik's point, and to some degree, is that it's like an orphan generation where so many people didn't feel they had that experience, that even when they did have that experience, instead they looked to a book or they looked to a rabbi to fill them in for every little step of the way of what to do. And Rabbi Kook, along with Chaim Soloveitchik, says, don't listen to your rabbi if your mother and father, who are religious Jews, did things a certain way, just continue to do it the way they did it. Now that's very subversive. That's why Mark Shapiro likes it. It's saying that he says there's a certain wisdom in the Jewish people. He doesn't mean Jewish people, all Jewish people, but anyone who is part of a religious community who has some Masorah, that we can trust them. And there are a lot of Gemaras that parallel this. When Hillel didn't know what to do about how to do the Karban Pesach on Shabbos, he says, the children of Israel are B'nai Nevi'im. They're the sons of prophets. They'll know what to do. And sure enough, they put the knives to slaughter the sheep into the sheep themselves when they marched up on Shabbos. So they didn't have to carry the knives. You know the Gemara, right? So these are to the wool of the sheep. No, thank you. No, they didn't stick. They didn't. Yeah. No animals were hurt. No animals were hurt. Yes, important details. So the point only here is that I want to try to stick to my timeline and end in a couple of minutes, as I said I would. But there's a lot of parallel in the complexity of the spirit that he took out as I'm not saying everything he read in Reb Tzadok was just something he parroted over. On the contrary, everything he felt as an emotional turmoil between reconciling these well-meaning young idealists and Judaism. And that was the only way to build the nation of Israel, was to get along with the communists, with the socialists who were building the land. The kibbutz movement was a socialist movement. So he had to almost like be open to the best part. And I'm going to share a story. I did share it Friday night at the dinner, but most of you were not there, so I'm going to share it again. This is a beautiful story that I heard from Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik. It's recorded. I heard the recording. He only went to Israel one time, 1935. What? Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik. He actually met with Rav Kook. He was interviewing for the position to be the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv. He didn't get the job. He was offered a number of years later to be the chief rabbi of Israel. He turned down that job. But at this visit, maybe they wanted him to go to see what was going on in a certain kibbutz. So it was a kibbutz by the Kinneret. It was a socialist, communist kibbutz. The way Rabbi Soloveitchik describes it is they were Stalinists, 1935. He gets to the kibbutz. He assumes for sure the kitchen has got to be treif, not kosher. So they offer him grapes, and he tells them, well, I don't want to eat the grapes either. They're like, why not? They said, trumos, maasros. He explains to them the laws of tithing, and he assumes that they don't know what he's talking about. They said, no. The rabbinate sends somebody, and they constantly are coming to take the tithes, and they've done that already. And by the way, if you're wondering about our kitchen's completely kosher. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't hold himself back. He says, you have a kosher kitchen? How did that happen? Because he was shocked, because these were anti-religious people. They said, let me tell you how it happened. A few years ago, Rabbi Kook came here. And he came here with his challah and his wine, and his gabbai, and that was it. And Friday night, he came to the dining room, and we were kind of like not really taken by him because we were busy. We had just came from the fields, and we're having dinner like it's a regular Tuesday night for us. He makes kiddush, he makes a motzi. Nothing coalesces around him. And then he asked us if there's any possibility of having a minyan in the morning. And we said, no, we work. Saturday is just a day we have to work in the fields. So there was no minyan. And by lunch, again, he makes kiddush. He makes hamotzi. The food obviously was not kosher. And maybe we had warmed up a little bit to him because we had seen him around, so long. He wasn't a critical person. But we had to go back to work. So we went back to work. But Saturday night, look, we're not working anymore. So we gathered around him. We said, let's humor the man. Let's hear what he has to say. He made Havdalah. And then for the next few hours, maybe more, he started talking about his family in Europe. He started dancing with us. And this went on. And we just started really loving this man. Beautiful person. And then we all went to sleep. And the next morning, he comes, and you have to understand, he probably didn't eat almost anything all Shabbos except for grape juice and challah. Like I said, the fruits, you got to take Trumas and Maestros. They didn't. And he says in Hebrew to them, next time, let's all eat a meal together. Next time, let's all eat a meal together. And then he left. And we understood what he meant. He meant if we had a kosher kitchen, I could have eaten with you. We could have eaten together. We immediately went and koshered the kitchen. We hired the rabbi, they koshered the kitchen. It's been kosher ever since. And Rabbi Soloveitchik concludes the story, and he says, if an aguda cherem was put on these people, multiple cherems, for whatever violations of Shabbos and Yom Kippur that they do, it would not have changed them one iota. But he says, Rabbi Kook was a religious personality. He loved God. It was a tactile sensation of all of his senses were connected to God. So him being there all Shabbos, him dancing with them, him talking to them, and not once condemning anything they did. Like I said, I am not on that level. Forget about it. I'm not Torah giant, but I'm not at that level of forgiveness to accept people who follow Stalin. I just don't have that in me. I can't do it. He had that in him. He was like the Baal Shem Tov. He loved every Jew, even these Farlorna people who all of the other rabbis condemned Rav Kook for having anything to do with them. He accepted them and he loved them. And many of them, like this kibbutz, loved him back in return and made a kosher kitchen. It's something, I have it written down. I can get it to you later. But anyway, thank you guys for attending.
Your book that tell all the stories of Rav Kook traveling.
Oh, yeah.
It's almost like a scientific version of Hasidic stories of him visiting the different settlements and his interactions with them.
Yeah, well, I'd like to get that book. I know that I